White initiates with a flexible, maintaining dynamic balance and showing a solid positional approach. The move the pawn to g6 by black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the pawn to d5, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the pawn to d4, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the pawn to c5 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly. This leads to the pawn on the d-file takes on c5, liquidating material and gaining active play, unlocking the pawn to e6 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the bishop to e3, guaranteeing long-term space control. White establishes central presence with, solidifying the position and maintaining a slight edge. Black develops, a solid developing move that maintains the existing dynamic balance. White expands on the queenside with a standard move that maintains their slight positional advantage. Black fianchettos the bishop to, solidifying the dark squares and maintaining the dynamic balance. White develops the knight to, reinforcing the center and holding their slight advantage. Black castles kingside, a standard safety maneuver that keeps the position balanced. The move the bishop to g5 by white is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the pawn to e4, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the pawn to d6, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the pawn to h3 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the pawn to e5 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the pawn to d5 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the knight to h5, guaranteeing long-term space control. Black challenges the bishop with a solid defensive move that clarifies the position. White retreats the bishop to, maintaining the bishop's activity and the solid balance. Black shores up the pawn structure with, reinforcing central control and maintaining equality. White prepares kingside space with a solid move that keeps the game equal. Black develops the knight to, supporting the central tension and maintaining the balance. White develops the bishop to, a solid developing move aimed at kingside castling. Black strikes in the center with, creating dynamic counterplay and challenging white's structure. The move the pawn on the d-file takes on e5 by white is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the queen to c2, centralizing the queen to dominate the coordinates. Afterwards, the pawn on the e-file takes on d4 executes a favorable trade. Continuing with the knight takes on d4, compromising the opponent's pawn structure, whereby the rook to e8 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the rook to d1 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the pawn to g5, guaranteeing long-term space control. Black recaptures with, solidifying the central pawn structure and maintaining equality. White castles kingside, a solid move to secure the king and maintain the balanced position. Black reinforces the center with, solidifying their pawn structure and preparing further action. The move the pawn to b4 by white is a mistake. A superior alternative was the queen to c2, centralizing the queen to dominate the coordinates, paving the way for the queen to e7, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the knight to d2 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the knight to b6 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the pawn to f3 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the bishop to f5, guaranteeing long-term space control. Black counters on the flank with a solid response that questions white's pawn advance. White plays a solid defensive move to support the queenside structure. Black captures, a solid exchange that resolves tension and maintains equality. White recaptures, a solid pawn recapture that keeps the position equal. Black activates the rook with, a solid exchange that simplifies and equalizes. White recaptures with, a solid queen development that maintains the material balance. Black advances, a solid pawn push that restricts white's pieces. White repositions the bishop to, a solid move to maintain piece activity. Black centralizes the knight with, a solid positional maneuver. The move the knight to d2 by white is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the pawn to c5, claiming key space in the center. Paving the way for the pawn to f5, significantly boosting piece coordination. Which enables the knight to d2 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly. This leads to the knight takes on g3, liquidating material and gaining active play. Afterwards, the pawn on the h-file takes on g3 executes a favorable trade. This allows the pawn to e4, guaranteeing long-term space control. The move the knight takes on g3 by black is a mistake. A superior alternative was the knight to f4, maneuvering the knight to an aggressive outpost. Paving the way for the bishop to f3, significantly boosting piece coordination. Which enables the pawn to f5 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly. This leads to the pawn on the e-file takes on f4, liquidating material and gaining active play. Afterwards, the pawn on the g-file takes on f4 executes a favorable trade. Continuing with the bishop takes on f4, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. White recaptures, solidifying the pawn structure and maintaining the positional advantage. The move the knight to b6 by black is a mistake. A superior alternative was the pawn to f5, claiming key space in the center. Paving the way for the pawn to g4, significantly boosting piece coordination. Which enables the knight to f6 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly. Whereby the rook to d1 secures an overwhelming positional advantage. Unlocking the queen to e7 with highly aggressive threats. Continuing with the pawn on the g-file takes on f5, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. White activates the rook with, solidifying central control and exploiting black's positional weaknesses. Black repositions the bishop to, a solid attempt to improve piece coordination. White centralizes the knight with, a strong move that increases pressure and positional dominance. Black centralizes the queen with, a solid defensive move trying to hold the position. White centralizes the knight to, a strong outpost that grants a clear advantage. The move the rook to a8 by black is a mistake. A superior alternative was the bishop to f5, exerting diagonal pressure to limit the opponent's space. Paving the way for the knight on the d-file to e4, significantly boosting piece coordination. Which enables the rook to a8 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly. Whereby the queen to b1 secures an overwhelming positional advantage. Unlocking the king to h8 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the pawn to g4, guaranteeing long-term space control. White exchanges knights with, solidifying their material advantage and maintaining crushing pressure. Black recaptures, a solid move to maintain piece activity despite the material deficit. White improves queen placement with, maintaining the strong positional superiority. Black recaptures, a necessary capture to avoid further material loss. White advances the pawn to, a strong positional move that creates further weaknesses. Black centralizes the knight to, a solid attempt to counter white's pressure. The move the bishop to c4 by white is a severe blunder. A superior alternative was the knight to e4, maneuvering the knight to an aggressive outpost, paving the way for the pawn to f5, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the knight to d6 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the bishop to f8 secures an overwhelming positional advantage. Afterwards, the knight takes on b7 executes a favorable trade. This allows the rook to b8, guaranteeing long-term space control. The move the queen to g4 by black is a severe blunder. A superior alternative was the pawn to e4, claiming key space in the center. Afterwards, the queen takes on e4 executes a favorable trade. Continuing with the queen takes on e4, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. This leads to the knight takes on e4, liquidating material and gaining active play, unlocking the knight to c3 with highly aggressive threats. Continuing with the knight takes on c3, compromising the opponent's pawn structure. White centralizes the knight to a strong move, consolidating their overwhelming advantage. The move the knight to c7 by black is a severe blunder. A superior alternative was the king to h8, claiming key space in the center, paving the way for the pawn to f3, significantly boosting piece coordination, which enables the queen to e6 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the queen to b3 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the pawn to g4 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the knight to d6, guaranteeing long-term space control. White captures with a solid check that maintains the overwhelming winning advantage. The move the bishop takes on f6 by black is an inaccuracy. A superior alternative was the king to f8, claiming key space in the center. Afterwards, the knight takes on g4 executes a favorable trade, which enables the knight to d5 to organize the counteroffensive seamlessly, whereby the queen to f5 secures an overwhelming positional advantage, unlocking the pawn to e4 with highly aggressive threats. This allows the queen to d7, guaranteeing long-term space control. White delivers another check with solidifying their overwhelming advantage. Black retreats the bishop to a solid move in a lost position. White captures with a decisive blow that secures the overwhelming victory. Black moves the king to a necessary move to avoid immediate checkmate. White advances the rook to a solid move that seals the overwhelming winning advantage.